Hello YouTube. Today we are going to be talking about how to defeat the beast, the demon, the ungodly abomination known as Eldlich. Timestamps down below if you want to skip to a specific part. Let's get right into it. I will be showing relevant gameplay in the background so you could follow along visually with what I'm talking about as I explain what's happening, but first things first, knowing your enemy is half the battle, and seeing a physical Eldlich deck list is extremely important to understand what you're dealing with. Now, a really good Eldlich list isn't going to be running hand traps, it isn't going to be running Lava Golem to tribute your monsters, it isn't going to be running Dogmatica cards, it's going to be nearly entirely pure trap cards, because an Eldlich player's plan is to set up those floodgates and lock you out of playing the game. The second that you start playing the game, they're losing. So knowing exactly what they're doing is the most relevant part, and we're gonna see how to get through it. This is gonna be the quick little summary, and then you could skip to the timestamp of the part of what you're struggling with. Now, the main things to deal with Eldlich is banishing their Golden Lords, realizing that they're gonna be hard searching for those powerful floodgates, and then it's gonna be their destruction effects, big emphasis on destruction, because Eldlich only destroys on board, they're banishing only in the graveyard, and their floodgates. Now let's get into the relevant matter. Now, first things first, you're going to have to understand what the Eldlich engine does, and I'm going to put a little infographic above so you could see and follow along as I talk about it, and you'll understand how the Eldlich engine floats. Now, the Eldlich cards are all about floating, which means that once those cards leave the field, they replace themselves with a different card. And the main cards you need to worry about in this floating effect is gonna be Scarlet Sanguine and Elixir of Black Awakening. These are the cards that summon Eldlich. And then the turn after that, once they have left the field and are in the graveyard, they can banish themselves to search out their disruption effects that they're gonna use to interact with you and mess up your board. And that's gonna be Hackero and Conquistador. And then, inversely, once those cards use their effect the turn after they were activated, or immediately if they're just sent to the graveyard, those cards are going to float again and go back into the cards that can special summon the Golden Lord. And Conquistador and Hackero are going to float into Black Awakening and Scarlet Sanguine. And that's why you don't want to get into a grind game with Eldlich, because they will out-resource you, going in this continuous loop with these resources and grabbing them back and forth until they run out or until you put a stop to them. Now, ideally, you want to end the game early against Eldlich. You want to set up a really strong board, or you want to be able to resolve Feather Duster or Lightning Storm or some way to clear their back row and end the game as quickly as possible. But sometimes the Eldlich player ends up going first, they end up negating your back row removal, or you just don't do enough on your turn and they go second and they're able to still set up these floodgates and stop you from playing the game. These are the situations I'm discussing in the video, so from now on, when I reference wanting to play this slow control and grind game with Eldlich, you never want to get into the slow game with Eldlich, because odds are they will out-resource you. But this is all under the assumption that you're forced into this game state, because if you were able to end it early against Eldlich and you were able to break down their board in a second, then you wouldn't be watching this video. Now, the most critical thing that we have to understand about Eldlich is that Golden Lord is the entire deck. This card right here is the life essence of the whole strategy that they have going. The second that they lose access to all their Golden Lords, they essentially lose the ability to play the game. At most, what they're going to be doing past that is summoning these 500 and 1800 attack trap cards, which are going to be very limited after the fact, and they're going to be trying to attack you down with nothing. So the second that you get rid of all the Golden Lords, the game's basically over. Now, you can accomplish this by spinning, also known as sending them back into the deck, but the most beneficial thing you're going to be able to do is banishing these Golden Lords. As soon as you banish all of an Eldlich Golden Lords, the game's over. You've already won. And you could notice here, it can be really through any effect that you can. It could be in the field, it could be in the graveyard, but Golden Lords are an extremely limited resource. Eldlich decks only run 2 or 3 copies of Golden Lord, because it's a card that, even though your entire strategy revolves around it, they're trying their best to keep it safe, keep it protected, because people will struggle to get rid of it. But most decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Have a way to deal with this. Not only is banishing an inherent part of many deck strategies like Tri-Brigade can with Shureg, but also many combo decks run cards like Called by the Grave, which typically you want to use to extend your plays, but if you're playing against Eldlich, don't get baited out into wasting these cards to try to do your fancy combos. Whatever your deck's game plan is, whatever your deck strategy is, comes second to dealing with Eldlich, and this is a huge key of playing against Eldlich. When you're playing against Eldlich, you aren't trying to combo off, you aren't trying to do your own strategy. What you're trying to do here is to stop the Eldlich player. When you're playing a deck like this, you essentially are forced to become the control player. You need to prevent this Eldlich player from doing whatever it is that they want to do. Now, focusing a bit more on basic Yu-Gi-Oh! Things that you need to know to improve as a player. It's a huge part of Yu-Gi-Oh! To keep track of your opponent's resources. Decks that go through a lot of resources will often end up revealing to you a lot of what they end up having. And you can see in this board state right now, both me and my opponent are playing Eldlich, and our boards are nearly empty. They're basically gone. I'm activating a spell card right now, but I have 1 card on the field. My opponent has 2 cards on the field. And this is where resource management, not for yourself, but for your opponent, really kicks in. Because you're going to see both of these fields fill up right now, but you're going to be aware of all of those cards. So right now, we both have 1 mystery card, and you're gonna see all these effects rail off, and this entire field fill up again in a really annoying fashion, but none of it should be a mystery to you. And that's what's absolutely critical about beating Eldlich. You should be aware of what resources they have at what time. Now, my opponent saw that I said a Hakero. Because your opponent said a Hakero, you should know there's a monster destruction effect on the field if he has Golden Lord. Set Elixir as well. They should know that's a summon from the deck if there's still a Golden Lord in there, or from the graveyard if all the Golden Lords are in there. So if they're all in the graveyard, you should be focusing on banishing the Golden Lord that they try to summon off this. And an Elixir of Black Awakening. This card isn't going to do anything until the next turn, which is again something very important to keep track of for both me and my opponent. Everybody should be aware of all the cards at the field at the same time, and if you miss something, be sure to click on the log at the bottom right and scroll through what happened. If you're struggling to remember exactly what went off, keep the log open during the game. It's not that intrusive. Play your game with the log open, but the second that you lose track of those resources and you're getting surprised by these effects, that's what you're gonna lose. My opponent should realize that even if they manage to destroy my field right now, I still have the Elixir of Sanguine on board, so no matter if they somehow destroy these Eldliches on board, they're not safe from the effect of Hakero. Sorry, this is a banish. They're not safe from that banish because that Eldlich player has access to a Golden Lord through this Elixir of Sanguine on field right now. Now, stopping your opponent from having these Golden Lords available is the most important part of your game plan. And if you're not able to banish them, you simply want to keep them from having access to them on the field at any given time when you're trying to do something. Now, this is why it's extremely important to understand how your opponent can access these Golden Lords. And Golden Lord is a bit tricky to get out in a pinch. Golden Lord itself can bring itself out if it's hard drawn, but that will cost your opponent 2 cards, meaning that they will have to go down 3 cards in hand in order to bring him out, which isn't always a big deal because Eldlich cards recur from the graveyard and search other versions of the card. As I'm sure you're aware, that's why they always have cards in field. The second way to bring out Golden Lord is You can also search the Golden Lord in order to do this through Cursed Eldland, but it could also search other Eldlich cards. Another way they bring out Golden Lord is Elixir of Black Awakening. This is a card you only have to worry about during the Eldlich player's turn. It's very disruptible, it's very slow, it's a very good Ash Blossom target. Lastly, the major way of bringing it out is Elixir of Scarlet Sanguine. I'm sure you're familiar with this card. It easily accesses Eldlich. It's one of the most consistent ways of doing it, especially because once Huaquero and Conquistador go to the graveyard, it's gonna be able to search out that Sanguine or that Elixir of Black Awakening in order to bring out that Golden Lord. So know what your opponent is doing, and if they're planning on bringing out a Golden Lord, because if you're not able to banish it, try to stop the effects that is going to get them to that Golden Lord. Now, I do want to hop back into the deck list real quick before I go back to showing some more gameplay while I talk about it, because another key thing to know about Eldlich, if you're a deck that's not able to really disrupt your opponent and you're just trying to commit to your own game plan, is knowing what protection effects are going to be valuable for you. And Eldlich, while it's really annoying, has one glaring weakness when it comes to their engine cards, and it's the fact that Eldlich cards all destroy on field. Eldlich can banish from the graveyard, which is a harder effect to deal with, but they destroy on field. And if you're finding that you're a deck that can't really interact with your opponent, you probably have some sort of strategy or some kind of protection effect in your deck, and likely you're running a couple of cards that are hard to destroy or hard to deal with. And here's really where we're going to see what Eldlich's destruction effects are. Now, Golden Lord can send himself and another card from hand in order to destroy a card, any card that you control, face up or face down. So again, destruction effect. Then we have Torrential Tribute. Torrential Tribute can not only miss timing, but that's more complicated, it only can resolve after a summon. So not only is it easy to kind of try to bait out from your opponent, but again, it's another destruction effect, and it's very predictable because it's only gonna happen after summons. But Torrential Tribute is one of the most devastating cards, so it is one of the ones to be most concerned about. Then we have Dogmatica Punishment. This is again gonna destroy two cards because it's typically gonna send Unce to the graveyard, who's also gonna get destroyed. This one is even more disruptible because if you manage to prevent the Dogmatica Punishment from destroying by somehow removing the card, moving it, it means that it won't be able to send Unce to get that second destruction effect. And lastly, we have the most consistent form of destruction that you're going to see, and that's going to be Conquistador of the Golden Land, and I'll talk about this a bit more later. But if somehow you manage to remove Eldlich in between this step, it's gonna, not to use a bad terminology, but it's gonna fizzle out and not be able to resolve. And again, it is a destruction effect. All of these cards destroy, and it might seem hopeless and dumb to think about it because it's so many cards that destroy, but again, if you're not a deck that's going to be able to disrupt your opponent, really try to play around them just destroying, because they're not removing from play, they're not banishing, they're not doing any fancy kind of removal, it's just nice and simple destruction effects. Now, while playing around destruction effects is extremely important, one very important thing to remember is that Eldlich the Golden Lord himself is a very chunky boy. So if there's one in the graveyard, he is going to come out for an entire turn, their turn and yours, as a 3,500 attack beater, which can be extremely menacing when you set up these anti-destruction monsters on your field. And it could be very daunting and very annoying to know that there's this much you have to deal with, but this is the final line of defense. But still, remember that even though that this is the final line of defense, this is going to cost your opponent resources, because in order to get Eldlich back on the field, they must remove a set back row card that they have. But still, it's very important to keep in mind how you're positioning things, what if your attack or defense that you're setting your monster in, because you do have this daunting threat if you're not able to banish it or send it back to the deck of this 3500 attack behemoth coming out if there is a Golden Lord in the graveyard. Now, back to the previous point, where when you're playing against Eldlich, you're not playing your deck strategy. Eldlich forces you to play a control game, and you're gonna have to, if you don't think you could finish the Eldlich off player immediately because they set up a weak board, you're gonna be forced to kind of pick apart an Eldlich player's board and play around their traps in a slow way, which is really annoying because once Eldlich has you playing slow, they can kind of out-resource you and outgrind you. And it's where we go back to where disrupting cards like Golden Lord or being aware of what they have really comes into play. So here in this line, I know that my opponent has a Conquistador, which I know is going to destroy my card. And again, it's a little weird because it's the mirror match, but I take it really slow. I passed a couple of turns, as you could see. This game is on turn 5 and I've done virtually nothing because I want to wait and destroy the Golden Lord the second that my opponent gets out the trap card. If I have a quick effect, for example, here it is the Conquistador, but because it's the mirror match. But if you have an effect like Zeus, if you have an effect like Trident, I really waited for my opponent to try to interact with me, and then I removed their Golden Lord from the field in the middle of their play, so they went ahead and activated a Conquistador for nothing, and now they just have this kind of useless body on the field. The Conquistador isn't in the graveyard, so it's not going to continue to draw cards, and the Eldlich was removed from play in a fashion that it also protected my board at the same time. Now, lastly, before we get into the Floodgates, the last card you really have to worry about as part of the Eldlich engine, and the only one that is not a destruction effect that you're really going to be dealing with, is going to be Hakero. And Hakero is its Banish effect, but again, it only hits the graveyard. So again, just keep track of what cards your opponent has set, and if that Banish effect is going to be relevant. Because an Eldlich player is going to pick and choose the situational card that they think is correct for your deck. But be aware that Hakero exists, be aware that it is an 1800 attacking body, and typically, if you're getting hit very brutally by the Conquistador, Hakero isn't going to hit your deck that hard, so just really try to play around getting banished, because getting your cards destroyed and getting your cards banished against Eldlich is an inevitable event, so you really just have to focus on what is the best way you can walk yourself into it if you don't have a way to deal with it, while still being able to play after. Lastly, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the thing that makes Eldlich the strongest, and that it's its access to Floodgates. Now, Floodgates are really polarizing, and this is where the video takes a bit of a turn, because the reality of Floodgates is that you need to build your deck around dealing with them. A lot of other things you can, the Eldlich core in general, is why Eldlich itself isn't really the problem. You can play around Eldlich, you can use your deck's strengths to deal with what you know they're gonna do. But Floodgates are very different, because Floodgates really are build around, and the reality is, if you want to be able to deal with Eldlich, you have to make sure your deck has an answer to them. Now, here you could see Lightning Storm, while a very strong response to it, gets countered by another Floodgate, and as it is Imperial Order. Now, with Imperial Order and Skill Drain on the field, unless my opponent built their deck specifically to hard counter Eldlich, they just kinda lost. And I'm gonna lead this into the how to counter section, but I'm gonna give a quick summary of what you want to worry about with the Floodgates Imperial Order is going to cost them 700 HP each turn, but unless they're at exactly 700 HP when the last Imperial Order procs, it's going to destroy itself instead of killing the player. But this is one of the most disgusting floodgates in the game, and it really comes down to, do you want to ignore it because it's only able to be run at one copy and just pretend it doesn't exist, which a lot of times is what I recommend doing. Just pretend this card doesn't exist, and if they draw it, well, shame, you lost the game to an unfair card. But if you are trying to play around it, Twin Twisters, Cosmic Cyclone, or MST are the best responses because you want to really bait your opponent into using it, holding those cards. If you have a quick play effect to destroy back row against Eldlich, you always wait until they activate a card before you use it. You don't clear the cards at the start of the turn. Unless you're using Feather Duster and Lightning Storm. In that case, you just have to hope that they didn't draw the Imperial Order or the Solemn Judgment. Now, here is the real biggest threat of the deck. While Imperial Order is a card you can ignore and just say, well, if they happen to draw it, I lost, and that is a reasonable thing to do. It's a reasonable strategy. Skill Drain is a card you cannot ignore. Not only because it's run in a variety of decks, not only Eldlich, so it's a very real threat that you need to acknowledge, but because it's at 3 copies, and that means that any deck that wants to run Skill Drain is going to see Skill Drain pretty often. This is a card that's going to be very commonly found in any Skill Drain strategy, and it really just ends the game. You could see that my opponent here is a Tri-Brigade player, and the game's just over. Skill Drain got flipped, and that means my opponent can no longer play the game. So without a way to out this card, the game's won. And again, it's a card that you should side against. Cards that you see often, cards that are consistent, cards like Herald. Herald is a card that Drytron can guaranteed bring out, so it is a card you want to consider when you're building your deck. Skill Drain is a card run in a variety of decks that just shuts off a deck's game plan, so you should have a way to deal with Skill Drain as well. And again, a lot like Imperial Order, it's a card that you don't have to deal with immediately. If you have a quick way to interact with it, you wait until you see this really powerful card. Sometimes that means sacrificing dealing with weaker cards. So if your opponent flips a There Can Only Be One, a Gozen match, or a Rivalry of the Warlords, maybe it's okay having that weaker board, because you have to realize that maybe if my opponent flips this handicaps how much damage I could do, but maybe if my opponent flips Skill Drain, then I lose if I answer that card. And lastly, for the Floodgates, we have 2 very common ones, is Gozen match and Rivalry of the Warlords. There Can Only Be One is also a big contender, but I believe that these happen a bit more often. Now, Rivalry of the Warlords sees less play in Eldlich, but it makes it so you can only control one type of monster, and this is a really good card for Eldlich to run because all of their monsters are zombies. So you typically really sometimes want to think, if there's unknown back row, how do I keep my line of play as a one specific monster time? So if you're playing a deck like Tri-Brigade, maybe if you have multiple names on field and you're thinking, I need to get out a Shureg. Shureg is a winged beast, so maybe have the card you summon on field be the Nerval, because it's also a winged beast. This is an extremely powerful card, and it's just something you have to think about. How do I keep my monster types the same before I go into this unknown back row? Rivalry of the Warlords is a card you'll be running into a lot against Eldlich. This, along with There Can Be Only One TCOBO, is a card that's going to lock you into specific typings. The difference is, even though Rivalry of the Warlord is easier for Eldlich to play with, it doesn't really hit meta decks very impactfully, so it's really just a shot in the dark of whether you're going to see this or There Can Only Be One. But once the Eldlich player activates these cards, you can sometimes abuse them and lock them underneath their own floodgates if you play smart enough and realize early on that they're not quite prepared to actively deal with it, and I'll go into that a bit more during There Can Be Only One section. there can only be one. Now, this is a very double-edged sword, and a lot of Eldlich lists are running this card because of how insanely powerful it is and how hard it hits the meta. But it's also something that can bite back on the Eldlich player, and one of the few floodgates that you can use against them as well. Now, again, if you weren't able to finish the game quickly against an Eldlich player in one of the opportunities you got, and you're forced into this slow grind game, feel free, sometimes you have to pressure the Eldlich player underneath their own floodgates. Now, here you could see I've put my opponent in a very uncomfortable spot where I'm really threatening their back row. So they hit me with a floodgate, and I realize I need to respond immediately. They deal with it protecting their floodgate, which used up a lot of my resources and dealt with a lot of my board. But now I've seen how far down this Eldlich's player's board has gone, and I realized I'm sitting in a position where I'm forced to play it slow. So I'm going to go ahead and let that Eldlich player rot underneath their own floodgate. So currently I only have one Golden Lord banished, so I know that this Eldlich player has at least one more in the deck, probably two, but instead of switching my monster to attack and dealing with this Conquistador, which is gonna go to the graveyard and let them access that Sanguine, I kinda just sit under this board state with my monsters in defense position so they can't crash and kill their own board, and I know that they can't go into a Link Spider or something like that, any sort of Link 1 in their extra deck, because they're sitting underneath their own Gozen match, and I'm really just actively using their own Floodgate against them. So they're in this awkward I need to wait 2 turn kind of spot, and they've already used up their light, which is the Pallades, and again, they're gonna often extravagance or somehow dump their resources. And the Eldritch player realized they were in this ridiculous spot where they were really uncomfortable under their own floodgate, and they weren't getting to play the game because of a card that they chose to run. This can also be done with There Can Only Be One. You're just gonna see it less often because it does hurt the Eldritch player. But if they do There Can Only Be One you, because again, it's such a strong floodgate that you will sometimes see it, know that your opponent put themselves in an insanely vulnerable spot, especially if you leave those trap cards on field, because Eldritch cannot deal with being forced into multiple attributes. Now the counter cards. The big difference between this and the other episodes of my How to Counter series is that those are just situational cards if you're facing a lot of these problems. These cards, if your deck doesn't have a natural out for the scenarios that I described earlier in the video into these floodgates, you need to be running at least one of these cards, and I'm going to go over them real quickly. Feather Duster and Lightning Storm are really good for decks that want to go second, or just generic cards that you can run in case you go second, but again, they're very weak to cards like Imperial Order. Twin Twisters is an insanely good card if your deck likes discarding cards, because it'll allow you to destroy cards and get whatever resource you may need in the graveyard. Then we have Called by the Grave. If you're playing a combo deck, consider running this card, and consider maybe, if you weren't able to go first, saving this to try to shut down the Eldlich engine if you see that they have several pieces of back row that you're not certain what they are. It might be more worth it to go for a weaker combo and save the called buys for getting rid of Eldlich and turning off some of that back row. Evenly Matched is really good if you're a control deck that doesn't really care about its battle phase and doing tons of damage. If you're willing to sacrifice your battle phase, Evenly Matched destroys Eldlich. And if you really just want to OTK, or you don't want to commit to having to run all these cards for Eldlich, I'd highly recommend running a copy of Red Reboot. It's kind of living all or nothing kind of lifestyle, because you either draw it or you don't. But in the games you do draw it, if you're confident in your deck's ability to OTK, then you should certainly be running Red Reboot. And lastly, if you're running a deck that makes any XZ monster and you keep it around during the battle phase, you probably should be running Zeus anyways, just in case of emergencies, and it's also super good against Eldlich. But it is very easily interruptible Oh, unlike the other ones, this one isn't a definite answer to Eldlich. This is just if you can't afford the main deck space. And that's all that there is to beating Eldlich. If you have any questions, even about specific matchups or anything you don't understand, just ask it down in the comments below. I'm always happy to help, and I always reply to every single comment I get to the best of my ability. And if you have any requests for the How to Beat series or the How to Play series, go ahead and drop a comment down below for that too. Actually, somebody left a comment on asking me to do a How to Play Prank Kids, and I actually made that video, and then I corrupted the file of the video when I was uploading it, but that's neither here nor there. But I will be uploading that next week. Hopefully you did enjoy the video, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button, or if you don't, you will be cursed to face 10 Eldlich matches in a row immediately after this video. Anyways, thank you for watching, and this is Rojas, signing out.